Good morning everyone, Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. On this channel, we have previously reviewed the Nikon 85 f1.8s, Viltrox 85 1.8Z, YongNuo 85 1.8. They are all native Z-mount autofocus lenses. Today we'll have a look at another native 85mm f1.8 lens for Nikon Z-mount. It is this Meike 85 f1.8 STM for Nikon Z. It is Meike's first autofocus lens for Nikon Z camera. One of the biggest selling points of this lens is the price. It is only $199 US, approximately half the price of the other two third-party 85 1.8 autofocus lenses and just 1/4 the price of the Nikon 85mm f1.8s lens. This makes it potentially a very attractive choice for any Nikon shooter who want a fast portrait lens. So in this video, we will have a look at this Meike lens design, feature and also its real-world performance. But we will also be comparing this lens with the three other autofocus 85 1.8Z lens that is currently available from Nikon, Viltrox and YongNuo and see if this Meike lens is too good to be true, or could it be a real bargain for people who don't want to spend too much money. A quick disclaimer as usual, the Meike lens I used in this review were sent to me by Meike, but they have no control of what I'm going to say in this review. It's just like the Viltrox and the YongNuo lens that I have here were also sent to me previously by those two companies for the previous reviews. I would like to say a big thank you again to Auckland Camera Center for helping me with this review and loan me the Nikon 85 1.8S lens. So go check out their shop or website, especially if you are from New Zealand. I'll put a link in the video description below. Now before we start, here is a set of portrait photos of my daughter shot with all these four 85mm f1.8 lens at f1.8. The camera was on a tripod and I asked my daughter to try not to move at all. All these photos were shot within 2 minutes. White balance was set to sunlight for all these photos. I made some very minor adjustment to the exposure before I export the RAW as JPEG, because even though I try to take the photo as quick as possible, the sunlight did still change a little bit, but otherwise I keep all the settings the same. So can you guys guess which photo were shot with the Meike, which were shot with the Nikon, Viltrox and YongNuo? So pause the video now and drop a comment below. I would like to see how many people can guess it correctly. I will reveal the answer a little bit later on in this video. The Meike lens has a pretty simple, understated exterior design and I think it looks pretty nice. The outside of the lens has a matte finish that also feels and looks very nice as well. But when you pick up the lens, you will probably notice the lens has a pretty plasticky construction. Not really surprising consider the very low price of the lens. The size of this lens is very similar to the Nikon and they both have the 67mm front filter thread. Compare the Meike to the two other third-party 85mm f1.8 lenses. The size of the Meike is somewhere between the two. The Viltrox is a bit bigger while the YongNuo is a little bit smaller. The weight of the Meike lens is only 359 grams thanks to its plastic construction. It is a bit lighter than the YongNuo and the Nikon and almost 200 grams lighter than the Viltrox lens. There is a focus ring near the front of the lens and also there is a AF switch on the side. You can customize the focus ring to control other settings like exposure compensation if you want through the camera's setup menu. I suspect this lens is based on the DSLR 85 f1.8 lens as the spec of the optics design appears to be identical. If you look at the back of the lens, you will see that there is no optics near the lens mount as well. While this is a budget lens, the lens mount is still made of metal, not plastic. On the lens mount, there is a USB connector for firmware update. Unfortunately, this is a micro USB connector, not a USB-C. I've mentioned it many times on my other reviews. I really think all the new products these days should use USB-C connector, which is the standard connector pretty much everyone uses. But this is another reason why I suspect this lens is based on Meike's 85mm f1.8 DSLR lens, as that lens also uses the micro USB connector. Meike did tell me that their upcoming lenses will use the USB-C connector instead. So hopefully this is the last time you hear me complain about micro USB connector on this channel. There's no rubber seal on the lens mount. I don't believe this is a weather sealed lens. The lens comes with a reversible lens hood that is also made of plastic. Again, the lens hood feels very plasticky and also a bit flimsy. Having said that, a plastic lens hood is actually not a bad thing, because if you accidentally drop a lens with a plastic lens hood, the lens hood can help absorb most of the impact. The lens hood may break, but it can provide more protection than a very solid metal lens hood. Because the lens has electronic contacts, so the camera would have all the lens information. When I bring the photo into Adobe Lightroom, I can see all the lens and shooting information like the focal length, aperture, and even the name of the lens. The software can also apply the correct lens profile correction. On a related topic, as I have explained in some of my previous reviews, all the image quality tests are done with the profile correction enabled unless I mentioned explicitly. So overall, consider the price of the lens. I think Meike did a reasonably good job in terms of the build quality and design. It may be a little bit plasticky, but I don't have any real issue with the construction or the build quality of this lens. This Meike lens uses STM autofocus motor. It is pretty quiet, but not exactly silent. I can hear a bit of autofocus noise when shooting indoor. The autofocus speed is fast and I was a little bit surprised. Here is a side-by-side comparison with the Nikon 85 1.8S lens test on the Nikon Z7 II. There is virtually no difference in terms of autofocus speed between these two lenses. It is also an internal focus lens, so the length of the lens doesn't change when it's focusing. Face detection works and also works well when I tested on the Nikon Z7 II. Continuous autofocus works and the accuracy is also not a problem. So autofocus works pretty much just like a Nikon S lens. I said pretty much, not exactly, because I do notice a little bit of issue. From time to time, the autofocus would not respond when I half press the shutter or the AF on button. And when that happens, I have to point the camera to somewhere else and focus on something else and then point it back to my subject and the autofocus would work again. To be fair, this issue also happened occasionally with the 3 other 85mm lenses that I'm testing, including the Nikon, but it seems to happen more often with the Meike lens. So I hope Meike can look into it and see if there's something that they can do to improve it by a future firmware update. Now, while the autofocus operation is reasonably quiet, I do notice there is noise if you stop down the aperture. You will hear some noise from the aperture when you stop down the lens, and the noise is louder than the autofocus noise. Once again, the other 3 lenses would also have a bit of aperture noise when you do that, but they are a lot more quiet in comparison. Okay, now let's have a look at the image quality. And the first thing I want to see is to compare these lenses and see if there's any difference in terms of the color from these lenses. So here is a test scene I shot with the camera fixed on the tripod. I use fixed daylight studio lights and match the white balance setting. So compare the color from these 4 lenses. there's surprisingly very little difference between all these photos. The colors are not exactly identical, but I have to check the RGB value or look at the histogram to tell the very slight difference that I can't really tell if I just look at the photos even side by side. However, one difference I do notice is the field of view. Even though they are all 85mm lenses, the Meike has noticeably narrower field of view than the three other lenses. The Viltrox, YongNuo and Nikon, they have very similar field of view and they are slightly wider than the Meike. So remember at the beginning of the video, I show you a set of portrait photos that shot with all the 4 different lenses and I asked you to guess the lens that I used to shoot each of these photos. Photo A is Meike, B is Viltrox, C is YongNuo and D is Nikon. So how many of you guys got it right? To be honest, I think the difference, especially in terms of colors, is really quite small, much smaller than I expected. The biggest difference is the field of view, but otherwise there is just so little difference between all these 4 photos. The minimum focus distance of this Meike lens is 85cm, which is very similar to the other 3 85mm lenses that we are looking at today. So in terms of the maximum magnification ratio, they are all very similar, which is just over 0.1 time. So the main difference is sharpness when taking photo at or close to the minimum focus distance. And here are a set of comparison photos all shot at around 0.9 meters, so very close to the minimum focus distance. If we look at the photos that were shot at f1.8, the image from the Nikon is the sharpest, the Viltrox is very close behind, YongNuo and the Meike has the softest photo while the Meike has more chromatic aberration. If we stop down the lens to f2.8, Meike's chromatic aberration become a lot less obvious and the sharpness from all the 4 lenses are now closer. So if you want some sharp close-up photos, especially if you shoot at f1.8, the Nikon and the Viltrox would be the better choice. But if you would stop down the lens a bit, then the difference will be much smaller. And now let's have a look at the image sharpness when taking photo at a slightly further away distance. With the Meike lens, if we look at the center, at f1.8, it is a bit soft with a bit of color fringing, but the center sharpness is acceptable and very usable. Stop down to f2.8, the center becomes much sharper. We reach the maximum sharpness at f5.6. With the 45 megapixel Z7 II, diffraction start to kick in at around f11 and the image would start to become softer after that. And now if we compare the Meike with the 3 other lenses, Meike and Viltrox center sharpness are very similar at f1.8. The Viltrox may be slightly sharper, but both these lenses has a bit of color fringing. YongNuo is sharper, but it is the Nikon that is the sharpest. Nikon is just very sharp even at f1.8. And here are some more side-by-side comparison photos of the center sharpness as we stop down these lenses. Okay, now let's have a look at the corner sharpness. At f1.8, the Meike lens doesn't really have much sharpness at the corner at all. It is very soft. Compared it with the other lenses, YongNuo is acceptable, Viltrox is slightly better than the YongNuo, and once again, it is the Nikon that is the sharpest. The Nikon's corner sharpness is so good that I actually need to double check to make sure it is the photo that I shot at f1.8. And here are the results when I stop down these lenses. The Viltrox and the YongNuo got pretty decent corner sharpness from f4, but with the Meike, we have to stop down to almost f8 to get decent corner sharpness. Now the corner sharpness photos that I showed you before were done with the photo focus at the center. If I focus at the corner instead, Meike's corner is still soft at f1.8, but it is noticeably better than when I focus at the center. So it suggests the Meike lens has a little bit of field curvature. While you could use any lens to shoot almost any kind of photos, but I think most people buying a 85mm f1.8 lens primarily want to use it as a portrait lens to create some dreamy portrait photos with shallow depth of view and isolate the subject from the background. So the quality of bokeh is very important for a lens like this. I think Meike did a pretty good job with this 85mm f1.8 lens. Bokeh looks pleasant. The transition from the foreground to background looks pretty nice. Bokeh balls only has a little bit of halo at the edge, and I think the bokeh looks pretty pleasant overall. And let's have a look at some comparison photos. This is a set of photos shot at f1.8. The bokeh all looks quite nice. I would say the Nikon has the smoothest transition at the edge of the bokeh balls. The bokeh from the Nikon looks the softest, but the Meike is also not too bad. The photos from the Meike does have lower contrast due to lens flare, but we will talk about that in a minute. In terms of the shape of the bokeh balls, both the Nikon and the YongNuo have a bit more obvious cat's eye bokeh. The Meike has less cat's eye bokeh effect, and the Viltrox renders the most rounded bokeh balls. If you look at the project photos of my daughter again, there's some difference in the background bokeh, but I think the difference is very small. Maybe you can tell me what you think and which one is your favorite. Now let's have a look at the vignetting performance. With the lens profile correction enabled, the Meike has really little amount of vignetting even at f1.8. I would say it's even better than the Nikon and is noticeably better than the Viltrox and the YongNuo. With the Meike, you only need to stop down to f2.8 and there is virtually no vignetting that is noticeable. YongNuo appears to be the worst this time, as you need to stop down the lens quite a bit more to reduce the vignetting to similar level. Now, what about if we disable the profile correction? With the correction disabled, the Meike lens has much stronger vignetting at f1.8, not really surprising. But while vignetting is more noticeable on the Meike with the vignetting correction turned off, it is still better than the other three lenses if vignetting correction is disabled on all these lenses. So this time, Meike is the best, followed by the Nikon and Viltrox. YongNuo is the worst in this run. We'll have a look at the chromatic aberration now. With the Meike lens, when I'm shooting some real-world photos, I do see a bit of color fringing in some of the photos around the high contrast area, especially if I shot those photos at f1.8. And let's have a look at some comparison photos. Viltrox and YongNuo both also have some color fringing, but at a lower level. And Nikon just have virtually no color fringing at all. And here is another set of photos shot at a much closer distance. The result is very similar as well. The Nikon has really minimal amount of color fringing. Viltrox, YongNuo and Meike all shows a bit of purple and green color fringing. The Meike has the most obvious color fringing. Okay, now let's have a look at distortion. One interesting thing is, all these four lenses have a small amount of pincushion distortion when I did my distortion test photo shooting a brick wall at about 3 meters or 10 feet distance. The Nikon is once again the best. It has the least amount of distortion. The Meike is second. It has a little bit more distortion than the Nikon, but it's still kept at very low level. This time it is the Viltrox and YongNuo that has the worst performance. It has most noticeable amount of distortion. But I would say the distortion is actually very well controlled by all these lenses, even the Viltrox and the YongNuo. Unless you are shooting something that like a brick wall photo or something with a very long straight line at the edge of the photo, you probably won't notice any distortion at all. Next, we'll have a look at the lens flare performance. With the Meike lens, when there is a strong light source in front of the camera, the contrast would drop a bit and part of the photo may look a bit hazy because of the lens flare. If you look at the side-by-side comparison test, it is very clear that the Nikon has really excellent lens flare performance. The Viltrox and the YongNuo has more lens flare than the Nikon, and Meike is the worst when it comes to lens flare. For portrait lens, the aperture blades are designed to deliver nice round bokeh and not so much about sharp, nice looking Sunstars. But with this Meike 85mm f1.8 lens, the Sunstars actually not too bad. At f11 we can already see some crisp Sunstars, and if you stop down to f22, the Sunstars look very nice. Compare it with the 3 other 85mm lenses, one advantage the Meike has is that its minimum aperture is f22, while the other lenses, they are f16, and usually a smaller minimum aperture would give you sharper Sunstars. Sunstars from the Nikon looks quite nice, almost as good as the Meike. On the other hand, Sunstars from the Viltrox and YongNuo just doesn't look quite as nice as the Meike or the Nikon. If you are a videographer or interested in doing some videography as well, let's have a look at the video performance. In terms of continuous autofocus performance in video mode, I tested with the Nikon Z7 II. Meike's autofocus works quite well overall and follows my movement reasonably smoothly. Sometimes there is a bit of overshoot when there is a big change in focus distance, but I think part of it is because of the camera. I noticed similar behavior even with the Nikon 85mm lens as well. It's just with the Nikon lens, the amount of overshoot is usually a little bit smaller. I mentioned the autofocus is quiet but not exactly silent. However, I do not think it is an issue for video shooting. If you're shooting outdoor, you won't hear any autofocus noise, even if you are shooting indoor, unless you are shooting at an ultra quiet place using built-in microphone. I believe you won't hear any autofocus noise at all. And what about focus breathing? I noticed the Meike lens has some noticeable focus breathing when I change the focus from 1 meter to approximately 20 meters. However, when I do a side-by-side comparison with the other lenses, I noticed the amount of focus breathing is not too different between all these lenses. All these 4 lenses have very similar amount of focus breathing. So what are my final thoughts of this Meike 85mm f1.8 lens for the Nikon Z camera? When I first heard about this $200 lens, my first reaction was, well, it's great that we have such a cheap native autofocus lens for Nikon Z users, but at the same time, the price really worried me quite a bit. You get what you pay for is usually true, so I'm not too sure if this lens would be just a cheap and nasty lens. Turns out the lens works quite well, so my worry was really just a worry. I think people looking for a budget portrait lens should be happy with this lens. But it's not to say the lens doesn't have any shortcomings. The major weakness of the Meike in terms of the image quality is the corner sharpness at wide open. It is noticeably worse than the other 3 lenses that we test today. You have to stop down the Meike to f8 to get decent corner sharpness. However, it may not be really an issue at all if you buy this lens for portrait, as you would usually want to blur the background, which includes the corner anyway. The lens flare performance is also not as good as its competitors, but overall, the image quality is pretty decent. In a lot of areas, the Meike is just as good as its more expensive competitors, and in some area, it is even the best, which is very impressive. Meike's build quality is certainly plasticky, which is not unexpected because of its price. While there's nothing wrong with the build quality, it certainly feels cheaper when compared to the other lenses that we look at today. On the positive side though, the plastic construction results in a lighter lens. It is the lightest 85mm f1.8 autofocus lens, and it is about 200 grams lighter than the heaviest Viltrox lens. It may not sound like a lot, but for some people, this is a huge difference. In terms of autofocus performance, it works, it's fast, it's reasonably quiet, accuracy is good, and even continuous autofocus works. However, Autofocus is not as reliable as the other lenses. I certainly hope Meike will make some improvement by a future firmware update. If Meike release a new firmware that improves the autofocus performance, I will definitely test it again, so check out my video description as I will update it if there is a new firmware that improves the autofocus performance. On the other hand, if you are a casual photographer or you are not shooting anything that is time critical, you should be okay with the autofocus performance, and I think this Meike lens offers you excellent value for money. $200 for a fast portrait full frame native autofocus lens with decent overall image quality, I think I can live with some small issues. This is the first time I compare these third-party 85mm lenses with the Nikon lens together. While the third-party lenses are good, Nikon is no doubt a much better lens. There are areas that third-party lenses can match the Nikon, but what Nikon does really well is that its overall consistency in pretty much every single area. If you want the best lens, Nikon would be your choice, but the downside is the price. You can buy 4 Meike lenses for the price of 1 Nikon. So is a good lens good enough for you, or do you want the best? It's a decision that you have to make yourself. So let me know in the comment below which lens is the one that you would buy.